Hi, this is Daniel Scrivner here with a quick preview of our next 20-minute Playbook episode, which comes out tomorrow. In it, I'm joined by Ben Blumenrose. Ben is the co-founder, co-director, and managing partner of Designer Fund, which is an early-stage venture capital firm that backs founders that both recognize the power of design and are committed to getting design right in their company from day one. Designer Fund was founded in 2012 when there were few other companies in Silicon Valley outside of Apple that even understood the power of design to build incredible products, create a category-defining brand, and ultimately forge an enduring company. At the time, there were also no venture capitalists with a pure design background. And yet, over the last decade, Designer Fund has built an exceptional venture firm. They've produced top quartile returns for their investors, beating out their peers in the market at large, and were early investors in a wave of design-centric companies that have defined the last decade, including Stripe and Gusto. Before co-founding Designer Fund with Enrique Allen in 2012, Ben was a design lead at Facebook for nearly 6 years after joining when the team was just around 100 people in size. In this episode, you'll learn why Ben is fascinated with AI like DALL-E 2 that can create original artwork, and what that might mean for intellectual property rights and monetization for artists of all shapes and sizes. Why design is utility-centric, where art is simply about expression, and Ben's thoughts on why design matters. What Ben has learned from studying natural ecosystems and why they make it clear that our growth at all costs mentality is flawed. Ben shares his favorite books, including the Murderbot series by Martha Wells about a violent self-hacking cyborg that's searching for the meaning of life, which I've since downloaded and is incredible. He shares his superpowers, including being able to tell when a product is incredibly well designed, as well as why the gap between great and extraordinary is much bigger than most of us think it is. And he shares the biggest lessons he's learned building Designer Fund over the last decade, as well as the advice he'd give himself if he could go back to the start of his career. Here's one of my favorite moments from it. Tune in tomorrow to listen to the full episode. How do you think about design, and what does design mean to you? And it's a very wide open question, so feel free to take that from any level, from any angle.
Maybe the way I will answer that is just like, why is design important to you? Is that maybe kind of, or like, why
That's
even
great.
care? Is that kind of
Yeah,
what you're
I
getting
think for a lot of people listening, that's probably the question they would ask.
why you should care? Yeah. So here's the thing, I think, and obviously I've spent decades thinking about this. When design is inherent in design, when done well, is this idea of creating something for a person to use. The act of deliberate creation for a specific use case, right? It's not art, right? There we have art. Design is really, it's meant to be, there's a utility there, right? So inherent in design is the idea that something should be useful. And hopefully, I hope for most designers, it's useful for good, right? So when you think about like the building blocks of a tech company, okay, you have designers, then you have engineers. What's at the core of engineering is it's like the motivation is solving complex problems, and there may be a user at the end of that, or may not be, right? So inherent in good engineering is not necessarily something that's more useful for a person, right? It could be, and it often is, but it doesn't have to be. It's not inherent in the work. And then you have, you go to business school. Okay, well, what gets business? People who go to business school excited. Well, for them, it's building a massive business, right? So like getting people to buy stuff or building something of value. So again, users people could be at the end of that in some way, but they don't have to be, right? And often what I found is there's like a tension there between domain experts, designers, engineers, and your MBA folks. And it just so happens that designers and maybe customer support people kind of play this role too. They're kind of the end user advocates often, right? And so they're the ones who are saying, well, wait a second, like who's going to use this? Why are they going to use this way? Why is this good for them to use? And so when you take that out of a company, all of a sudden like the balance is off, right? If you have like engineers solving really tough, difficult engineering problems and business folks trying to build a big business, well, there's all sorts of ways to like manipulate and have that grow in a way that actually isn't serving humanity well. And it's not to say like to get up here and be like, oh yeah, design's the end all be all and we always do it right. We don't always do it right, but there's something inherent in design done well that is that, when you break it down to just its core essence, it's trying to help people do things well. And so for me, that's why it's really important, because when you take that away, and that's honestly like why we started Designer Fund. It wasn't like I had a ambition to be an investor by any means, but it's just that people were asking me for help on design so much, on things like education and healthcare. And you start thinking, well, wait a second, if design is absent from these, from the building of these products and services, then who's here to make sure that, in hospitals, that patients are being cared for the right way? Who's here to make sure that students are being cared for the right way, versus just like building something that's good for the school system or good for the hospital, right? So that's the thing that I think for me is the importance of why I'm so like into getting design at the ground floor of every like great company that is getting started today. Because if not, we're just going to get those products and services. And we've all experienced it, right? Like if you've gone to a doctor recently and you've watched the doctor look at the screen half of the time or more versus look at you, the patient, you've kind of felt what happens when design is absent from these things. That's kind of the thing we're trying to fight against. So yeah, that's kind of like why for me design is so important, and why I fight for it and advocate for it and try to like advocate for it in the VC ecosystem.
Yeah. I love that perspective. I mean, it almost sounds like a way to think about design in your mind is as guardrails. It's like you can channel the resources, meaning your engineers and the money that you've raised as a business and all these ideas and feedback you've gotten from customers in a lot of different directions. And maybe design adds a little bit more intentionality and tries to just make sure that that's all pointed and harnessed in the right direction.
Yeah. And I would say, one of the thits that I'm trying to also champion, there's this idea of like human-centered design. You've probably heard of this, right? Mm-hmm. And that sounds great. So that's what's human. It's basically designing for an individual. But I think one of the things that's lacking in human-centered design is like humanity-centered design, right? Because when you're optimizing for the individuals, well, then what happens to the ecosystem at large? And I think, frankly, this is basically what happened at Facebook, is we were trying to create this thing that every individual got a lot of utility out of, assuming that if people loved it for themselves, that would somehow create value or like move humanity in the right direction. And my personal opinion is that it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm going to give you yourself, the person, something that works for you, without taking into account, well, how does that work for you and your community? How does that work for you and your country? How does that work for you in the world? And so that's another piece that I'm hoping like more formal design education starts to take into account, is kind of like the humanity-centered approach to design and have that be baked into the work that we do.
Yeah.